The cold morning air bit through the thick leather of Oberleutnant Karl Bauer's flight jacket as he stood on the damp grass of the airfield at Saint-Trond. It was March 6, 1944, 7:32 hours. The scent of petrol, damp earth, and the faint, ever-present odor of cordite from distant flak batteries filled his nostrils. He watched the ground crew swarm over his Focke-Wulf Fw 190-8, their breaths pluming in the crisp air. The aircraft's broad, radial engine nose gave it a pugnacious look he loved. It was a killer. His killer. 42 confirmed kills were painted in small black crosses beneath his cockpit canopy. 23 Soviet, 12 British, 7 American. The Americans had been the easiest. Slow, clumsy, predictable, flying their flying fortresses in neat, suicidal boxes, shepherded by those laughable Republic P-47 Thunderbolts they called jugs. Big, heavy things that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, and supposedly couldn't fight. His wingman, the young, brash Lieutenant Erich Vogel, bounded over, his face split by a confident grin. Another day, another herd of fat American turkeys to shoot, Karl. Vogel slapped the fuselage of his own Fw 190. Intel says a maximum effort. Hundreds of bombers heading for the ball-bearing works at Erkner, a feast for us and the flak. Bauer allowed himself a thin smile, adjusting the silk scarf around his neck, a gift from a French girl in Paris 2 years and a lifetime ago. Just remember your drills, Erich. The Thunderbolts will break off at the coast. They always do. No range. Then the bombers are ours. He ran a gloved hand over the cool, riveted metal of his plane. The BMW 801 engine, now being warmed up, throbbed with a deep, powerful rumble that vibrated up through his boots. This was the Western Front in early 1944, and for expert like Bauer, it was still a hunter's paradise. The tide had turned in the east, everyone knew it, but here in the skies over Festung Europa, the Reich was still master. What Bauer, Vogel, and the entire Jagdwaffe High Command could not possibly comprehend was that the calculus of aerial warfare had already been irrevocably altered. While they slept in their quarters at Saint-Trond, a revolution was crossing the English Channel, a revolution not of 1 or 2 new planes, but of an entire industrial ecosystem they had fatally underestimated. The briefings they received, the intelligence summaries they read, were based on a reality that had ceased to exist 6 months prior. The Americans hadn't just built a new fighter, they had built a machine to end an air force. The confidence of the German aces was not born of mere arrogance, but from a long, unbroken string of successes. From the fall of France to the deep penetrations over England and the slaughter of unescorted bombers in 1943, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm had dominated. Pilots like Bauer were gods. The Fw 190, introduced in 1941, had been a shock to the RAF, outperforming the Spitfire Mkv in almost every regard. Their tactics were refined to a science. The massed frontal assault on bomber formations, the Sturmbach Fw 190s armed with 13 cannons designed to tear the heavy bombers apart in a single pass. German intelligence, the Abwehr, provided comforting numbers. Reports from late 1943 estimated American production of the P-47 Thunderbolt at around 250 per month. High, to be sure, but manageable. The Thunderbolt's performance envelopes were well documented in their tactical manuals. A top speed of 426 mph, a service ceiling of 42,000 feet, but with a cripplingly short combat radius of just 275 miles. The doctrine was simple: wait for them to turn back at the German border, then pounce on the unprotected bombers. The P-51 Mustang, a rumor, a recon plane, nothing more. A few had been seen, but they were dismissed as light reconnaissance aircraft, not long-range escorts. The technical comparisons, printed on crisp paper and distributed to every grupp, were unequivocal. The Fw 190-8 could outclimb, out-accelerate, and outroll the P-47 at most combat altitudes. It was a better gun platform, with a tighter turning radius at lower speeds. On paper, based on the data they had from encounters in 1942 and early 1943, the German pilots held all the cards. They were the veterans, flying the superior machine, defending their homeland. The Americans were the interlopers, the amateurs. A few dissenting voices had been raised, only to be silenced by the weight of institutional confidence. A Luftwaffe technical officer, Hauptmann Fischer, who had studied wreckage of a newer model P-47D shot down near Bremen, had filed a report noting the unusually robust construction of the turbo-supercharger ducting and the apparent installation of a new paddle blade propeller. He suggested these might indicate significant performance improvements, particularly at the high altitudes where the American bombers flew. His report was stamped for information and filed away, a footnote in a mountain of paperwork. Another pilot from JG-26, returning from a harrowing encounter over Wilhelmshaven, had sworn the thunderbolts he faced had stayed with him much deeper into Germany than should have been possible. He was told he was mistaken, that he had misjudged his position, that the stress of combat played tricks on the mind. The culture of the Jagdwaffe, built on the invincibility of its aces, had no room for such heresy. They were about to pay the ultimate price for their close-mindedness. While German pilots slept, the industrial colossus of the United States was delivering a thunderous response. The narrative of American industrial inferiority was perhaps the most catastrophic miscalculation of the German high command. They were still thinking in terms of European cottage industries. America waged war with the soul of a Detroit assembly line. The Republic Aviation Plant in Farmingdale, New York, and its massive new facility in Evansville, Indiana, were not merely building airplanes. They were stamping them out like automobiles. The German estimate of 250 P-47s per month was a pathetic underestimate. By March of 1944, Republic was delivering over 400 P-47s per month. In the first quarter of 1944 alone, they produced 1,200 Thunderbolts. To put this in perspective, the entire German production of single-engine fighters for the same period, FW-190s and BF-109s combined, was less than 1,500. The Americans were outproducing the entire Reich in just one fighter type. This numerical deluge was built upon a bedrock of breathtaking technical innovation, masterminded by a Russian-born immigrant, Alexander Kartveli. The P-47 was not the jug or the bucket of bolts the Germans mocked. It was the most technologically advanced and brutally powerful piston-engine fighter in the world. At its heart was the Pratt & Whitney RA-2000 800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial behemoth that produced 2,000 horsepower. But the true genius, the feature that would shatter German tactical doctrine, was the General Electric turbosupercharger. This was not a simple supercharger. It was a complex system of ducts and intercoolers that forced compressed air into the engine, allowing it to produce full power at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where the thin air starved conventional engines. The Germans knew of turbo-supercharging in theory, but they had never mastered its practical application on such a scale. The P-47 didn't just fly high. It reigned supreme there, in the thin, cold air where the B-17s flew, and where the FW-190s and BF-109s gasped and wallowed, their performance falling off a cliff. The airframe itself was a testament to American engineering philosophy, strength and survivability over finesse. It weighed over 7 tons empty, more than twice as much as a BF-109. It was built around an egg crate structure that could absorb phenomenal punishment. Its .850 caliber Browning M12 machine guns, mounted 4 to a wing, delivered a combined rate of fire of 32.0 rounds per minute. This was not just a fighter, it was a flying battery. Each .50 caliber round was a devastating projectile, with far greater range, velocity, and hitting power than the German 20 cannon shells. A 1-second burst from a P-47 placed 80 pounds of lead and steel into the air. A 1-second burst from an Fw-100 and 90 standard armament of two 20 cannons and two 13 machine guns placed about 25 pounds. The men flying these machines were no longer the farm boys with 100 hours of 1942. The U.S. Army Air Forces had implemented a grueling training program that was now producing pilots with over 400 hours of flight time before they ever saw combat. They were taught energy fighting tactics, how to use the Thunderbolt's incredible weight and power to their advantage in devastating boom and zoom attacks from high altitude. They were learning, adapting, and improving at a rate the static, veteran-depleted Luftwaffe could not match. The first, faint tremors of this coming earthquake had already been felt, but the German command structure, sclerotic and arrogant, had systematically ignored them. The signs were there, had anyone cared to connect them. On January 11, 1944, during a raid on Oschersleben, a pilot from JG-1 had radioed a frantic, confused report. "The Thunderbolts. They are still with us. Over Halberstadt. They are not turning back." The message was logged, but the intelligence analysts at the Reichsluftwaffe Ministerium dismissed it. The pilot must have been disoriented. The P-47's combat radius was a known, fixed quantity. It was impossible. In early February, a more detailed report came from a swarm leader of JG-3. He described engaging P-47s near Magdeburg, nearly 400 miles inside Germany. He noted their incredible speed in a dive. "They fall like stones," he wrote, "and we cannot follow. They then climb back to altitude with a speed that defies belief." This report was also filed away. The prevailing theory was that these were isolated incidents involving specially modified, lightened aircraft, or that the pilots were jettisoning their external fuel tanks early to gain performance. Then came the photographs. In late February, a reconnaissance Bf-109 managed to photograph the U.S. airfield at Debden. The photos, when analyzed, showed rows of P-47s fitted with strange, bulbous underbelly tanks, far larger than the standard 75-gallon paper drop tanks the Germans knew about. These were 108-gallon metal belly tanks, and even more ominously, 150-gallon cylindrical tanks that could extend the Thunderbolt's range by hundreds of miles. The photo interpretation officer circled the tanks and wrote a memo suggesting a review of the P-47's performance specifications. His superior, an old-school colonel who had flown biplanes in the Great War, scribbled "unlikely" across the top and initialed it. The culture of denial was complete. The most damning evidence came from the loss rates themselves. The carefully maintained kill ratios that had sustained Luftwaffe morale were beginning to shift. In the last week of February, the ratio of bomber losses to fighter escorts lost had shifted from 3:1 in favor of the Germans to nearly 1:1. Veteran aces, men with 50, 60, 70 victories, were not returning from missions. The official explanation was always the same: flak, collision, pilot error. The possibility that they were being bested by American pilots in American planes was never seriously entertained. The German fighter arm, the once invincible Luftwaffe, was flying blind into a hurricane of its own making. Back at Saint-Trond, the alarm klaxons began their piercing wail. The briefing was swift and confident. The Wehrmacht's four-engine bombers were coming. A huge stream, over 600 bombers, heading for Berlin. Their fighter escort was expected to be the usual P-47 groups, which would peel away near the Dutch-German border. The Fw-190s of JG-26 and the Bf-109s of JG-1 would take off, climb to altitude over the Rhine, and wait for the bombers to become vulnerable. Bauer pulled on his leather helmet, the cold earphones pressing against his head. He climbed onto the wing root and lowered himself into the cockpit of his Fw-190, White 11. The familiar smell of oil, leather, and high-octane fuel filled the cramped space. He fastened his harness, checked his instruments. The engine roared to life with a satisfying bellow, the whole airframe shaking with pent-up power. He glanced over at Vogel's plane, seeing the young pilot give him a thumbs-up. Bauer nodded back, a grim, professional gesture. This was just another mission. A big one to be sure, but routine. He taxied onto the grass runway, the FW-190 bouncing slightly on its wide-set landing gear. The controller gave the signal. Bauer pushed the throttle forward, the BMW engine responding with a deafening roar. The acceleration pressed him back into his seat. The tail came up, and then he was airborne, retracting the gear, climbing steadily into the overcast March sky. He joined his swarm 4 aircraft in a tight, practice formation, and began the long climb to 28,000 feet. The plan was to rendezvous with other Gruppen over the Rhine, forming a massive Gefechtsverband of over 200 fighters, a fist poised to smash the American bomber stream. The climb took nearly 40 minutes. The sky above the overcast was a brilliant, hard blue. The air was thin and cold. At 28,000 feet, Bauer leveled off, his flight joining dozens of other FW-190s and BF-109s circling a designated beacon. It was an impressive, heartening sight. The power of the Jagdwaffe, concentrated and ready. He scanned the sky to the west, expecting to see the contrails of the bomber stream and the smaller, shorter contrails of the P-47s as they reached their limit and turned for home. He saw the bomber contrails first, a vast, tangled web of white lines smeared across the western horizon, a sure sign of a maximum effort. Hundreds of them. Then he looked for the escort contrails. They were there, too, but they weren't short. They extended back deep into Germany, weaving through the bomber stream, and there were more of them than he had ever seen. Not dozens, hundreds. A voice crackled over the R/T, the frequency reserved for the Gefechtsverband commander. Achtung, Indianer, many little friends, they are still with the bombers. The voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Bauer had never heard before. He focused his eyes, straining against the glare. The little friends weren't just P-47s. There were other types mixed in, sleeker with laminar flow wings, Mustangs. And they weren't just shepherding the bombers, they were roaming ahead and above the stream, aggressive, hunting. His stomach tightened into a cold knot. This was wrong. This was not the briefed mission. The comforting numbers, the known performance envelopes, the predictable American tactics, they were all dissolving before his eyes. The R/T came to life again, this time with a new, urgent tone. Horrido, bombers at 12 o'clock high. All units prepare to attack from the front. Ignore the escorts if possible. Break on my signal. Bauer clicked his microphone twice in acknowledgement. He tightened his grip on the control stick, his thumb resting on the red firing button for his cannons. He watched as the massive formation of B-17s and B-24s grew larger, a breathtaking, terrifying armada of destruction. And swarming around them, above them, and now, he saw with a jolt, diving down from an even higher altitude, were the escorts. They weren't ignoring the German fighters. They were attacking. The first group of P-47s hit the top-cover German fighters of JG-1. Bauer, from his position, saw the specks of the diving Thunderbolts grow rapidly. They weren't just diving. They were accelerating at a rate that seemed physically impossible for such large aircraft. They fell out of the sun like avenging angels, their 8-gun wings winking with deadly light. The R/T exploded with confused, frantic voices. They're too fast. Brake left, brake left. Where did they come from? Bauer saw a BF-109 from JG-1 simply disintegrate under the weight of fire from a single P-47 pass. It wasn't shot down, it was obliterated. No smoke, no fire, just a sudden, violent puff of pieces. Then he saw them. A second wave of P-47s, higher still, was beginning its dive. Not towards the main German formation, but curving around, a classic pincer movement. They were using their altitude, their speed, their power, all the things the German intelligence said they didn't have in sufficient measure. The Gefechtsverband commander's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. All units attack the bombers. Now, ignore the fighters. It was the only order that made sense according to their doctrine. Break through the escorts, absorb the losses, and kill the bombers. The survival of the Reich depended on it. Bauer pushed his throttle to the emergency war power setting, the Fw-190 surging forward. He led his swarm in a shallow climb, aiming for a gap in the escort screen to get at the B-17s. For a few seconds, it seemed it might work. They were closing on the bomber stream, the huge aircraft filling their windscreens. And then the world exploded around them. The high-cover P-47s, the ones that had been curving around, slammed into the side of the German formation. They didn't engage in turning dogfights. They made one high-speed, slashing pass, their 850 calibers hammering, and then they used their incredible energy to climb straight back up out of reach to set up for another pass. It was a tactic the Germans had no answer for. You couldn't turn with them because they wouldn't turn. You couldn't outrun them in a dive because they were faster. You couldn't outclimb them because they had more power. Bauer caught a glimpse of a P-47 as it flashed past his canopy, close enough for him to see the checkered nose art and the pilot's helmeted head. The sound was not the pop-pop-pop of cannons, but a continuous ripping, fabric-tearing roar from its guns. It was the sound of industrial warfare. "Karl, on your tail, break right, now." Vogel's voice was a scream in his headphones. Bauer slammed the stick right and back, kicking the rudder, executing a violent brake turn. Tracers streamed past his canopy, so close he could feel the heat. He craned his neck, trying to see his attacker. It was a P-47, hanging in his blind spot with a tenacity that defied everything he knew about the aircraft. It was supposed to be a lumbering bus, not a nimble killer that could stick to his tail in a hard turn. He reefed the Fw-190 into a tighter turn, feeling the airframe shudder, the G-forces pressing him down into his seat. The P-47 stayed with him. It shouldn't have been able to do that. Its turn radius was supposed to be wider, its roll rate slower, but this one was different. It was matching him move for move. He tried a different tactic, rolling inverted and pulling into a steep dive, hoping to use the Fw-190's legendary roll rate and acceleration to escape. He pushed the throttle through the gate, the engine screaming. The airspeed needle climbed rapidly, 400, 450, 500 km/h. The ground rushed up. He glanced in his mirror. The P-47 was still there. Not only was it there, but it was gaining, in a dive. The Thunderbolt was actually catching him. The stories were true. The reports they had dismissed were real. A cold, sickening realization washed over him. This was not an isolated incident. This was not a fluke. The sky was full of these things. He could hear it on the R/T, the desperate shouts, the calls for help, the static that followed a final, cut-off transmission. The proud Gefechtsverband, the concentrated fist of the Jagdwaffe, was being systematically torn apart. They weren't just losing a battle, they were witnessing the end of an era. He pulled out of the dive at less than 5,000 feet, his ears popping, the strain making his vision gray at the edges. He was over a patchwork of fields and forests, hopelessly separated from the main battle. He looked for Vogel. He saw a plume of black smoke on the horizon, but no sign of his wingman's aircraft. Then he saw it. Climbing up towards him, its dark green camouflage stark against the patchy clouds below, was a single P-47. It wasn't diving. It was climbing. At an angle that looked like a vertical wall. It was climbing to meet him, to finish him. The sheer, impossible rate of climb was something he had never witnessed in any aircraft, German or Allied. It was as if the laws of physics had been suspended for this one American machine. Bauer's mind raced, the carefully memorized performance charts and tactical manuals crumbling into dust. Everything he had been taught, Everything he had experienced in over 200 combat missions was useless. He was low on fuel and ammunition. He was alone, and that thunderbolt, climbing with the relentless certainty of an executioner, was coming for him. He had two choices: run or fight an enemy he no longer understood. He turned into the climb, a gesture of defiance, a last, desperate act of a pilot who knew his world had just ended. He pushed the throttle forward again, the engine responding with a tired roar. The two aircraft, the nimble, battle-hardened Focke-Wulf and the industrial, unstoppable Thunderbolt, closed at a combined speed of over 800 kilometers per hour. The P-47 filled his Rivi gun sight. He pressed the trigger, feeling the familiar shudder as his two 20 151 cannons and two 13 100 and 31 machine guns spat their shells. Tracers reached out, arcing towards the climbing American fighter, and then he saw the flashes, not from his own guns but from the P-47's wings, all 8 of them. A solid wall of 50 caliber fire erupted from the Thunderbolt, a storm of lead that walked up through the sky towards him, impossibly accurate, impossibly dense. In that final, frozen second before the world dissolved into noise and metal, Oberleutnant Karl Bauer understood the terrible, simple truth they had all missed. They hadn't been laughing at a clumsy, inferior aircraft. They had been laughing at their own funeral pyre, and the 50 caliber shells were already punching through his engine cowling. The first impacts were not explosions, but a series of violent, metallic concussions that hammered through the airframe. The BMW 801 radial engine, the very heart of his Focke-Wulf, disintegrated into a storm of shrapnel. A piston rod, sheared from its crankshaft, smashed upwards through the engine block and tore into the cockpit, missing his legs by centimeters. The instrument panel exploded in a shower of glass and splintered metal. The world narrowed to a deafening roar of tearing metal, and the acrid stench of burning oil and high-explosive incendiary rounds. His head snapped forward, his forehead striking the gun sight. A bright flash of pain, then warmth as blood poured down his face, blinding his right eye. The FW-190, now a mortally wounded beast, shuddered violently and yawed to the left, its nose dropping. The control stick went slack in his hand, useless. He was no longer a pilot. He was a passenger in a 7-ton coffin. Through the blood and oil smearing his canopy, he saw the P-47 fill his vision for an instant, a dark, brutal shape climbing past him with an effortless, terrifying grace. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, its mission accomplished. There was no malice in the pass, no personal vendetta. It was a clinical, industrial execution. White 11, I'm hit. Engine dead. Bailing out, he screamed into his microphone, but the R/T was dead, the wires severed. The only response was the shriek of the wind through the shattered canopy and the groan of the dying airframe. He fumbled for the canopy release handle, his gloved fingers slick with blood and oil. It refused to budge, jammed by the structural deformation. Panic, cold, and absolute seized him. He was trapped. The ground, a mosaic of brown fields and dark forests, began to spin, slowly at first, then faster. He was in a flat spin, the classic death sentence for the FW-190. The centrifugal force pinned him to the side of the cockpit. He drew his 9 Luger from its shoulder holster, a desperate, futile gesture. He fired twice at the armored glass of the canopy. The bullets sparked and ricocheted, one grazing his thigh with a searing pain. The glass was starred but held. He was going to die. The thought was not dramatic but simple, factual. The 42 black crosses, the confidence of the morning, the briefings, the tactical manuals, all of it was meaningless scribbles on a burning page. The hunter had become the prey, and the paradise was a slaughterhouse. A final, violent lurch. The starboard wing, stressed beyond its limits, tore away at the root. The spin became a chaotic, tumbling cartwheel. The G-forces slammed him into the cockpit wall, then the ceiling. Something cracked in his ribs. The world became a blur of sky, ground, and pain. Then, miraculously, the tortured airframe around him gave way. The canopy, its frame twisted, tore loose from its rails and vanished into the slipstream. The sudden decompression sucked the breath from his lungs. He didn't think. Instinct and training took over. He ripped his oxygen mask away, unfastened his harness with a single, practiced motion, and hauled himself out of the disintegrating cockpit. The slipstream caught him like a giant's fist, slamming him against the fuselage, then hurling him clear. He tumbled through the cold air, the wind tearing at his clothes, the roar of his dying plane fading to a distant scream. He pulled the D-ring. The silk parachute blossomed above him with a sharp, reassuring crack, the harness jolting him violently. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind in the shroud lines. He was dangling beneath a white canopy, descending slowly into a world that had fundamentally changed. Above him, the battle raged on. The sky was a scribble of contrails, the dark specks of diving fighters, and the ugly black blossoms of flak. But the sound was different now. It was not the staccato bark of German cannons, but the continuous, ripping snarl of 50-caliber fire, a sound that dominated the heavens. He saw a Focke-Wulf, its wings outlined in flame, spiral down. Then another. A Bf-109 simply came apart, its fuselage breaking in two behind the cockpit. The R/T chatter in his mind was replaced by the memory of those frantic, desperate voices. They were being slaughtered. He looked down. His own aircraft, White 11, was a burning scar on the landscape, a pyre of black smoke marking its grave. He counted 3 other pillars of smoke within his field of view. 4 aircraft from his Gruppe, maybe more, already gone. The proud Gefechtsverband, the fist of over 200 fighters, had been shattered in minutes. His descent brought him lower. He could see farmers in a field pointing up at him. He saw a road and a column of German military trucks, their progress halted by his spectacle. He landed awkwardly in a plowed field, the impact driving the air from his lungs and sending a fresh wave of pain from his ribs. He collapsed, the parachute silk billowing around him like a shroud. He lay there for a long moment, staring at the cold, gray March sky, the sounds of the distant battle a dull rumble. The hunter's paradise was gone. The Reich was no longer master of these skies. He had been shot down by an aircraft that, according to every briefing he had ever received, should not have been there, should not have been able to climb like that, should not have been able to pour such a volume of fire into his plane. The truth was as cold and hard as the ground beneath him. They had lost, not just the battle but the war in the air. It was over. A group of Landesschützen, older Home Guard soldiers with aged rifles, approached him cautiously. One of them, a grizzled sergeant with a World War I Iron Cross on his tunic, helped him to his feet. "Easy, Herr Oberleutnant. You are lucky to be alive." The sergeant looked up at the sky, his eyes narrowed. "It is a bad day up there. Very bad." Bauer could only nod, wiping the blood from his eye with the back of his glove. He was led to a Kübelwagen and driven back to Saint-Trond. The journey was a silent, nightmarish parade. They passed 2 other crash sites, a Bf-109 buried in a farmer's barn, a Fw-190 scattered across a kilometer of woodland. The scale of the defeat was written on the French countryside. When he arrived back at the airfield, the atmosphere was funereal. The morning's confident buzz was gone, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. The ground crews stood in small, quiet groups, staring at the empty hardstands. Of the 24 Fw-190s of his Gruppe that had taken off that morning, only 7 had returned. And of those, 3 were so badly damaged they would never fly again. He saw Vogel's plane. It was not there. His hardstand was empty, a void more eloquent than any words. The debriefing was not the usual triumphant recounting of victories. It was a somber, confused collection of horror stories. Pilots spoke in hushed, shaken tones. They were everywhere. I dove away from one and another was already waiting below. My cannons hit one square on. It just kept flying. They climbed back up after a pass as if they were on a string. The Gruppenkommandeur Major Strauss, a man with a knight's cross with oak leaves, sat behind his desk, his face ashen. He listened to each report, his hands folded in front of him. When it was Bauer's turn, he simply said, "I was engaged by a single P-47 at low altitude. It outclimbed me, outdove me, and its gunfire destroyed my aircraft in one pass. I was lucky to bail out." There was no need for embellishment. The bare facts were devastating enough. Strauss nodded slowly. "The initial estimates from the raid. We lost 68 fighters today. 68. For 22 bombers confirmed shot down." He let the numbers hang in the air. The kill ratio, the very foundation of their strategy, had not just been inverted. It had been annihilated. The Americans called it Big Week. We thought it was propaganda. It was not. In the following days, the grim reality solidified. The March 6th mission was not an anomaly. It was the new normal. The Luftwaffe was bleeding to death. The signs that had been so systematically ignored now became an inescapable avalanche of bad news. At a Luftwaffe repair depot near Bremen, Hauptmann Fischer, the technical officer whose report had been filed away months earlier, now stood over the wreckage of a P-47D that had finally been brought down by concentrated flak. He was not triumphant. He was awestruck. With a team of engineers, he carefully dissected the American fighter. What they found was a revelation that bordered on terror. The turbo supercharger system was a masterpiece of mechanical complexity. "Look at this," Fischer said, his voice hushed as he traced the intricate ductwork. "The exhaust gases spin this turbine at over 20,000 revolutions per minute. It forces air into the intercooler, then into the engine. It maintains sea-level manifold pressure at 30,000 feet. Our engines are gasping for air at that altitude, producing half their rated power. This thing is at full strength." He held up a section of the propeller blade. "And this paddle blade propeller, the efficiency is staggering. It bites the thin air where our props just slip." One of his junior engineers, a young man named Weber, pointed to the airframe construction. "The armor plating is thicker than ours. The self-sealing fuel tanks are more effective. And the engine, it has a radial design. It can absorb incredible punishment and keep running. Our liquid-cooled engines. A single rifle bullet in the cooling system and it's over." Fischer picked up a spent .50 caliber shell casing. "And this is their real secret. It is not about the aircraft alone." He arranged 10 of the large casings in a row on a workbench. "A 1-second burst from this aircraft puts this much metal in the air. A 1-second burst from one of our 190s puts out the equivalent of maybe 3 of these shells in weight. They don't need to aim as carefully. They just hose the sky with lead. It is a quantitative advantage that becomes a qualitative one." He filed a new report, marked "Urgent Eyes Only." It contained detailed diagrams, performance calculations, and a stark conclusion. The P-47D, particularly with the new paddle blade propeller and improved turbo supercharger, outperforms the Fw-190-8 at all altitudes above 20,000 feet. Its dive performance is superior to any aircraft in our inventory. Its ability to absorb damage and return to base renders our current armament largely ineffective. Our tactical doctrine is obsolete. This time, the report was not filed away. It landed on the desk of Generalfeldmarschall Erhard Milch, the man in charge of German aircraft production. He read it, then read it again. He then summoned his top advisors. "Is this accurate?" he demanded. A senior staff officer, a veteran of the Condor Legion, nodded grimly. "It is, Herr Generalfeldmarschall. The losses confirm it. Our pilots are being massacred. The Americans are not just escorting their bombers to the target. They are escorting them to the target and back. They have achieved what we thought was impossible, complete air superiority over the Reich." Milch sank back in his chair. "What can we do? The Fw-190D, the Ta-152. The Dora is coming, but slowly, too slowly. The Ta-152 is a paper project." Even if we started full production today, it would be 6 months before they reached the front in meaningful numbers. By then, the officer didn't need to finish the sentence. By then, the invasion would have come and gone. The problem was not just one of quality, but of overwhelming quantity. While the German High Command was reeling from the technical shock, the industrial reality was delivering a second, even more crushing blow. In a prisoner of war camp in England, Oberleutnant Klaus Müller, a bomber pilot shot down over Kiel, was put to work on a farm. One day, his work detail was sent to repair a fence near a major railway line. He stood and watched, his pitchfork forgotten in his hand, as a seemingly endless train rumbled past. It was not carrying troops or tanks. It was carrying aircraft. Wingless fuselages of P-47 Thunderbolts stacked on flat cars, one after another. He lost count after 50. The train took over 10 minutes to pass. He turned to the British guard, a corporal who spoke passable German. How many? The corporal shrugged. That's just the weekly shipment from the docks. They unload them from America, send them to assembly plants, bolt the wings on, and fly them off. That lot will probably be shooting at your mates within a fortnight. Müller returned to the camp that night a broken man. He gathered his fellow Luftwaffe. I have seen it, he said, his voice hollow. I have seen the river of aircraft. We are not fighting an air force. We are fighting a factory that has wings. For every one we shoot down, 10 more take its place. The war is lost. We have been fools. The news of the industrial disparity filtered back to Germany through letters from POWs and intelligence summaries that could no longer hide the truth. The numbers were staggering. In the first 3 months of 1944, German factories produced 1581 single-engine fighters. In the same period, American factories produced 2455 P-47s alone, plus 1,200 P-51 Mustangs and 900 P-38 Lightnings. The United States was producing more fighters in 3 months than Germany could produce in a year. The cottage industry, miscalculation, was now costing 1,000 lives a week. The impact on the Jagdwaffe was catastrophic. The loss of experienced pilots was irreplaceable. In April of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 400 experienced fighter pilots. The training schools, starved of fuel and harried by Allied strafing attacks, could not hope to keep up. The average experience level of a German fighter pilot plummeted. Where men like Bauer had entered combat with over 2 years of training, new pilots were now being sent to the front with less than 150 flying hours. They were lambs to the slaughter, their life expectancy measured in a handful of missions. The culture of the expert, the ace system that had been the backbone of the Jagdwaffe, collapsed. The high-scoring aces, the national heroes, were being systematically hunted and killed. The American fighter sweeps were no longer just about protecting bombers. They were about the deliberate destruction of the German Air Force. The P-47s, with their long range, would roam deep into Germany, not waiting to be attacked, but actively hunting for Luftwaffe aircraft in the air and on the ground. Back at Saint-Trond, the airfield itself was no longer a sanctuary. Bauer, grounded with a broken rib and a concussion, watched from a slit trench on April 12th as a squadron of P-47s appeared at treetop level, their engines screaming. They were not bombing. They were strafing. The 850 caliber guns on each aircraft tore through the parked FW-190s, the maintenance hangars, the fuel bowsers. The air was filled with the sound of ripping metal, exploding fuel drums, and the screams of men. The ground crews, who had once swarmed over his aircraft with such purpose, were now running for their lives or lying dead on the grass. The hunter's paradise had been transformed into a shooting gallery, and the roles were brutally reversed. The psychological collapse was as complete as the physical one. Pilots began to show signs of extreme combat fatigue, something that had been rare in the early, victorious years. They developed angst, a paralyzing fear of combat. Some deliberately turned back from missions with engine trouble. A few, The most disillusioned simply flew to Switzerland and interned themselves. The unshakable confidence of the Jagdwaffe was replaced by a grim, fatalistic resignation. They knew they were flying to their deaths. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. With air superiority irrevocably lost over Western Europe, the Allies could now prepare for the D-Day invasion with impunity. Reconnaissance flights photographed every inch of the French coast. Bombing raids systematically dismantled the French railway network, isolating the potential invasion areas. The transportation plan would have been suicide had the Luftwaffe still been a potent force. Now it was carried out with brutal efficiency. On the Eastern Front, the crisis deepened. Desperate to stem the tide in the west, the German High Command was forced to withdraw fighter Gruppen from the east, leaving the ground forces there vulnerable to the massive Soviet air armadas. The collapse was becoming general. By May of 1944, Oberleutnant Karl Bauer was back in the air, but the war he knew was over. He was now flying a Fw-190 Aminus 8 that was, in every measurable way, inferior to the enemy he faced. The missions were no longer about victory, but about survival. The confident grins were gone. The briefings were now grim lists of losses and warnings about the overwhelming escort. On a mission to intercept bombers heading for Cologne, his new wingman, a 19-year-old named Schmidt with just 30 hours on the Fw-190, was shot down in the first pass by a P-47. Bauer never even saw the American fighter. It dove, fired, and climbed away, all in less than 5 seconds. Schmidt's plane just came apart. There was no return fire, no evasive maneuver. It was a clinical, effortless kill. Bauer returned to base alone, his fuel low, his ammunition unused. He had not even gotten close to the bomber stream. The sky belonged to the Thunderbolts and Mustangs. As he taxied to his dispersal point, he saw the ground crew chief, a veteran who had serviced his plane since 1942, look away, unable to meet his eyes. The shame of survival was a heavier burden than the fear of death. The final, official recognition of the disaster came in a secret report circulated at the highest levels of the Reichsluftwaffe Ministerium in late May 1944. It was a cold, statistical post-mortem. In the period from January to May 1944, it read, "The Jagdwaffe has lost 2262 pilots killed or missing. This represents over 50% of the fighter pilot strength available at the beginning of the year. The loss rate is unsustainable. The primary cause is the qualitative and quantitative superiority of the American P-47 and P-51 fighters, which have rendered our defensive tactics obsolete. Air superiority over the Reich has been lost. The initiative in the air war now rests entirely with the enemy." For Bauer, the personal reckoning came on a clear day in early June, just before the invasion. His swarm was bounced by a flight of 4 P-47s near Aachen. The fight was short and brutal. One of his comrades was shot down immediately. Another was forced to crash land. Bauer and his remaining wingman dove for the deck, weaving through valleys at treetop height, the Thunderbolts clinging to them like wolves. He could hear the American flight leader on the open frequency, his voice calm, almost bored. "Red 2, you take the one on the left. I've got the leader, make it count." Bauer jinked left, then right, but the P-47 stayed with him, its pilot expertly anticipating his moves. A burst of .50 caliber fire ripped through his left wing, shredding the aileron. The controls went heavy. He was low on fuel and options. Ahead he saw a small, grass-covered field. It was his only chance. He chopped the throttle, dropped his flaps and landing gear, and prayed. The Fw-190 bleeding speed sank towards the field. He felt the wheels touch, bounce, then settle. He was down. He looked back to see the P-47 roar overhead, its pilot waggling his wings in a gesture that was not triumphant, but merely professional, before climbing away to rejoin the fight. Bauer climbed out of his cockpit and stood on the wing of his aircraft. He was unhurt. He had survived again. But as he looked at the undamaged fields of France and heard the distant, fading roar of the American fighters, he knew that survival was no longer a victory. It was merely a postponement. The technological and industrial storm that had broken over them on March 6th had swept away the world he knew. The experts were dead, their skills made irrelevant by a tide of machinery and production they could never hope to match. The hunter's paradise was a distant memory, replaced by the grim reality of a lost war. He sat down on the wing, his head in his hands, and for the first time since he was a boy, Oberleutnant Karl Bauer, with 42 confirmed kills, began to weep. He was not weeping for himself or for his dead comrades, but for the terrible, simple understanding that they had all been instruments of their own destruction, outthought, outbuilt, and utterly defeated by an enemy they had never truly understood. The funeral pyre they had laughed at had indeed been their own.